He's going to come to the White House very shortly, within the next week or less.
Just ahead, what we've learned about Carney's agenda and how quickly these trade negotiations could unfold. The Conservatives, meanwhile, are in uncharted waters. Their leader, Pierre Poilievre, no longer has a seat in Parliament, and his campaign is facing fresh criticism from two Conservative premiers.
I think the Conservative Party of Canada was very good at pushing people away, not so good at pulling people in.
Last time I checked, Pierre Poilievre never came out in our election. Matter of fact, him or one of his lieutenants told every one of his members, don't you dare go out and help the PCs. Isn't that ironic?
Coming up, we'll put those comments to Conservative MP Chris D'Entremont and ask him about the state of Poilievre's leadership. And both the NDP and the Greens are facing tough questions about their future after many voters abandoned them. Later, we'll speak to Heather McPherson, one of the 7 surviving New Democrats, and the sole Green MP, leader Elizabeth May. Power and Politics starts right now. We've got the Power Panel all here in the studio, ready with their take on what's next for all parties and all of their leaders after Monday's election. But first, according to U.S. President Donald Trump, Prime Minister Mark Carney is going to the White House any day now for a meeting. Here are Trump's comments earlier today when asked about Carney's election win.
He called me up yesterday. He said, "Let's make a deal." You know, he was running for office. They both hated Trump, and it was the one that hated Trump, I think, the least that won. I actually think the Conservative hated me much more than the so-called liberal. He's a pretty liberal guy. But no, I spoke to him yesterday. Couldn't have been nicer, and I congratulated him. You know, it was a very mixed signal because it's almost even, which makes it very complicated for the country. It's a pretty tight race, but he's a very nice gentleman, and he's going to come to the White House very shortly, within the next week or less.
All right, well, Mark Carney is here in Ottawa preparing his minority government for the work ahead, and Louis Blouin is the Parliamentary Bureau Chief for Radio-Canada, and he joins me now. All right, Louis, well, that was some election analysis I never gave on Monday night, but that is the President's take on what happened. What do we know about the timing of Mark Carney's visit to the White House?
So we know it's going to be in the next few days, according to the President, and the Office of the Prime Minister said yesterday that it would be in the close future. So let's guess a little visit next week, probably beginning of next week, to see the President at the White House. I found it interesting that he noted that the race is tight. It was tight here in Canada. So maybe he's prepping his leverage when he's going to negotiate with Mark Carney. You know, he might not be in a comfortable position of a majority government. So that he signals that is that, you know, it's going to be probably a tough negotiation with him. But it's going to be quite a test for Mark Carney. The expectations are very high, David, as you know, because the whole election was about that. And that's how he sold his message to Canadians. So every detail will matter. You know that the performance in front of the camera is maybe as important as what will happen behind closed doors. You know how Justin Trudeau at the time handled the handshake. How will Mark Carney do this time? So it's those small details that will be interesting to watch, but also what happens in the background. That means putting a frame around the negotiation that is coming with Canada on this economic agreement that Mark Carney has been talking about. One signal I got from a source in government is that they noted that the popularity of the President is going down at this time. That could give them some leverage, but I don't see Donald Trump doing a lot of concessions on what he wants. He talks a lot about, the milk sector. He talks about the wood, the softwood. He talks about cars. So we'll see where it goes, but it's going to be a high-risk operation next week.
Yeah, his popularity is going down. The economy's in contraction. Job rate is slowing, but here we are. He continues on. Okay, so Donald Trump is giving details on Mark Carney's itinerary, which may or may not be true. We are going to hear from the Prime Minister maybe tomorrow, more likely Friday, as I understand it, with an update on where they are in their transition process and when things are going to. What are you hearing about where they are in because they've got a bit more time than after he won the leadership. What are you hearing about the state of the more fulsome transition for Mark Carney?
So we're hearing that he's just now trying to place everybody in the important strategic positions around him. There's names circulating about a possible chief of staff. We know that Marco Mendicino is in that function at this time, but there's other names that are circulating. Cyrus Reporter was a former advisor to the Prime Minister too, that is circulating. Janice Charette, who was in charge of the transition also. So we'll see where it lands, and if Mr. Mendicino is staying around, could there be other advisors that come maybe from Quebec or others? That's what we're going to be looking for in the next few days. Setting up the priorities for the next few weeks. Negotiation, yes, with Donald Trump, but also the bills that will be tabled in Parliament. So I have a big scoop for you. It's now on the calendar of the House of Commons. May 26th, it seems, is the beginning of the next session. And that's also what I'm hearing from a source. I was talking about the 26th, 27th of May, that Parliament would return. You know, there's going to be a throne speech. Budget after that, a few bills, I'm told, including the one to get those trade barriers down between the provinces. That would be before Canada Day, as the McPherson promised. So it's going to be quite a busy schedule for the next few weeks, for sure.
Yeah, all those people, Louis, said to us, so you'll get some downtime after the election. We're going to go right into a meeting at the White House. We're going to have the trade negotiations, and Parliament's going to come back as he lays out his
I hope
legislative
for
agenda.
at least a week of break, David, where we're not getting it. I don't know. I guess you get used to it.
That's how we live now. Okay, so the other big thing that's got to happen even between now and then, Louis, with May 26th is the start of Parliament. Yep. The new cabinet, I know we have a new cabinet, but sort of, I don't want to say that's a fake cabinet, but the real cabinet, now that he's had an election, got some people to run for him, he's got to fill that out. Just as a final point, I mean, it's going to need to be bigger probably than it is now to make space for some of the new faces. What are you hearing there?
Absolutely. And we're hearing, and my colleague Laurence Martin was able to confirm that it's looking around more 30. We're around 20 now. It's more around 30, so it's going to be bigger, but not as big as Justin Trudeau's was. It was around 38. So I'm looking for a few names that could come into this cabinet. If you look at Quebec, Carlos Letao is the former Quebec finance minister in Quebec. You know, he has a good reputation. Could he end up somewhere in Treasury or something economic related? We'll see, but that could be interesting. I'm looking maybe at Evan Solomon also, who has a high profile, former reporter. He was
the host of this show. I sit in that chair. Yeah,
exactly. And also Gregor Robertson, former Vancouver mayor. He's a very good politician too, so they might want to get him in the mix at some point. So we'll see where all this lands, but there's going to be interesting choices. Could there be also people moving around, some titles who were consolidated that might be separated? We'll see where it goes.
Yeah, because those are three men that you named there, and he has promised a gender parity cabinet in this one. All right, Louis, always appreciate the intel. That is Louis Blouin, the Parliamentary Bureau Chief for Radio Canada. Okay, all of this leaves us with a lot to dig into with the power panel. They're all here with me in the studio. Carleen Verheyen was a former Chief of Staff to multiple Liberal cabinet ministers. Tim Powers is a former strategist for Conservative parties. Jordan Leichnitz is a former NDP strategist, and Sherelle Evelyn is the managing editor of the Hill Times. It's good to see you all again. Carleen, let's start with you. As the Liberal here, what do you know about what's going on in there? I mean, it seems like he's got a somewhat durable minority, given what's going on with the Conservatives and going on with the NDP. What do you expect to see in terms of the early stamp Mark Carney's going to put on things?
He's going to move fast. There's two reasons for that, I think. One, he's spent an election campaign now for 5 weeks talking about the urgency of meeting the moment, whether that is standing up to Donald Trump, including in a few days, as we're learning, as well as getting the country into a place economically where it can diversify its trading relationships away from the U.S. So right. I think you'll see things in swift order. So probably a cabinet in the next 14 days. I think we'll see Parliament resume probably after the Victoria Day long weekend. You'll have a speech from the throne, which will kind of lay out that broad agenda. We would expect to have published mandate letters as well, where we see kind of what each minister's priority is. And then they'll bring Parliament back. It will be a unique Parliament in the sense that both of the two major party leaders, well, two of the three, I should say, without Yves-François Blanchet, won't be there. You'll also have a Prime Minister and a Liberal Party leader who's taking his seat in the House of Commons for the very first time, doing his very first question period. A lot of firsts. And amidst all that, he's probably going to need to table a budget, at least a mini budget, deliver on some first key campaign commitments. Then he's got to go out to Kananaskis and host the G7 Leaders Summit by June 15th. So
that's a slow schedule we were all promised after the April 28th vote.
Exactly.
Tim, Louis' sources, my sources, Ashley Burke and others have been hearing it would be May 26th for Parliament. It's now on the House of Commons website, as Louis pointed out, so I guess our scoop is accurate. It's interesting, the amount that has to happen between now and then, because the country does not have a budget because of the prorogation that happened. It still functions legally under interim supply, but he's got a lot of big things to do in this short period of time while also dealing with Donald Trump just on the parliamentary side of things.
Yeah, there's another clock too, right? There's the immediate, and then there's the clock of opportunity. And I think, as we know about minority governments, you get more done in the beginning, though I think he will try and govern as he should, like Stephen Harper did in 06 and 08 to begin with, as his opposition is figuring out their own challenges and opportunities. And that's his nature anyway. I mean, he describes himself as a hockey player, which he is, but he's also a runner, and he's used to going and going and going and going. And if he is going to be a prime minister, as he talked about, who wants to do transformative things, it's a lot easier to try and jam them all in at the front when nobody else can put up their hand and say no, or we're not prepared for that. The thing I firmly believe too, and Carlene's heard this already today, so I apologize to her, I think Mark Carney, sorry Liberals, is going to be a prime minister who recognizes that if he's going to do a lot, he's going to care about getting that done in a short period of time and will pay less attention to getting re-elected. That he's going to be a one-term prime minister, but the hell of an active one, and he's going to do as much as he can in that term to do it. And I think he feels unencumbered as other politicians have. So the pace we're going to get now, maybe the pace we get till it's slowed down after the other parties deal with their own difficulties.
Look at Tim trying to fire the starter's pistol on a Liberal leadership race when Mark Carney hasn't even been 4 days since he won the election.
Love that energy.
But Jordan, it does seem like he is determined to be decisive and swift-moving, which, you know, in the early days of Trudeau, there was a bit of that. It got a little bit more deliberative, shall we say, as they went on. You know, even with the minority, it seems like he has a mandate to focus on these big things, and the structure of the Parliament certainly seems to give him the breathing room for that.
Yeah, well, I mean, you remember Deliverology, that brief.
I do remember that. Yeah.
It was a brief interlude, but look, he has to move quickly, and I think that that's a huge part of the appeal that he was presenting to voters during the election, was the idea that he was going to come in, he was going to take charge of this threat from Trump and make some swift changes that are going to protect Canada from that. He also has a political incentive and necessity to move quickly. I think his honeymoon ended the minute he stepped off his stage from the victory speech. There is going to be very little tolerance if it's seen that he's not delivering some results on these things. So these first 100 days, I would argue, are going to be more crucial for him than they have even been for previous prime ministers. The votes that he got that allowed him to get his government that ended up being a little smaller than they were hoping for, a lot of those votes were loaned, particularly from the New Democrats. And it's easy for those to go back if those people aren't seeing results for what they hired him for effectively, which is to deal with the Trump problem. So I think he's wise to move quickly. Whether he's going to be able to move quickly, though, in this configuration of Parliament is a question that we don't yet know the answer to. Because while he may be tempted to govern as though he has a majority, the actual seat makeup means that that's going to be very challenging.
Yeah, like Sherelle, I know the New Democrat argument that the vote was lent, but you know, of the 17 seats they lost, 10 of them went Conservative because they picked up a lot of Democrat votes, particularly in southwestern Ontario. The Bloc vote got lent in a big way in Quebec too, right? But whoever it is, he does have this expectation of delivery, and right out of the gate, you got the president saying, "Yeah, he's coming here next week." And I talked to a Liberal like, "Oh, I guess I better find out if that's true." But I mean, what do you expect to see in the initial push here?
Yeah, I think like what everybody said, there's going to be, and there has to be that quick push right out the gate. But I do think that, you know, to Tim's point about he's not worried about being reelected, you know, we should be so lucky to have all politicians have that mindset of not worrying about, am I going to get reelected, instead of, am I going to deliver for Canadians? Because that is what people at this point really want to see. They want to see, are we going to get what we were promised in this election, which is how do we deal with Donald Trump?
Yeah.
And that's a really tall order because, you know, as you know, docile, if you will, as Donald Trump sounded today, we know that he turns on a dime. Yeah. So Mark Carney can go down there and have what he thinks is a really good conversation with the American president. And by the time he leaves the room, Trump could be posting on Truth Social that's completely, you know, different to whatever it is that they actually talked about. And, you know, whether or not you want to pretend or say that Trump is, has some sort of machinations and this was all part of his master plan as to, who he wanted to get elected in the Canadian election.
No.
which is not the way to go. But if you wanted to think about it in that frame to a degree, then, he doesn't have to worry now about who his Canadian counterpart is. That's already decided. He already knows that it's going to be Mark Carney. He knows this is who he's going to be dealing with for the long term. So he doesn't have to, play any games on that front. He can now do what he wants. He always does what he wants, but he can. But knowing who's across the table from him, that sets the stage, that sets the table. And whether Canadians are going to get what they want out of this negotiation, that's a different question. But he absolutely has to move quickly to do it.
Yeah, Carleen, just a final point to you. I mean, a trip, since Volodymyr Zelensky went to the Oval Office, there is downside risk to those appearances. Now, I'm 100% positive that Mark Carney will wear a suit. I don't know if I've seen, other than the dancing
well, and I
hoodie.
hope it's not a meeting that happens in front of the cameras.
Well, but a part of it will be, though.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty clear because, the Canadian media will travel on this and they'll want at least a spray of that to get a sense of it. So just, we'll talk a little bit more about the dynamic in Parliament without Pierre Poilievre in a bit, but just the importance of that just optically and tonally. I mean, what does that need to look like for this to be a promising start for the Prime Minister?
The pressure on any Canadian Prime Minister who has dealt with Trump, which is effectively just Justin Trudeau and now Mark Carney, has always been immense. Anytime there's been a state visit, I think the nation has collectively held its breath, and we have good reason to, right? I mean, think about when Trump came to Canada's last hosting of the G7 in Charlevoix in, I believe it was 2018, where Trump got mad right at the end and flew off early in a huff and didn't sign the communique because Justin Trudeau had ticked him off.
No, he signed it, but then he unsigned it from the air on his way to meet the North Korean dictator.
That's
because,
right.
that's how it works, right?
Yeah. So historically, these meetings have sometimes been very challenging. I think that for Mark Carney, it's also a challenge because although he has a lot of experience in boardrooms, he's, again, a brand new politician. And so he will be approaching this not with a lot of deep political experience, but a different set of experience. Right. So I think that there will be a lot of pressure on him. I also don't think we're going to see a lot come out of that first meeting. It's very likely to be a little bit anticlimactic. A cordial conversation, a communique that agrees to begin a Kuzma negotiation in
and
the
maybe
coming
who
months.
the lead negotiators are, these sorts of things, right?
Exactly.
It could be something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay, all right. We're going to pause this for a second, and we're going to pivot now to the Conservatives and where that party stands after Monday's federal election. And to do that, we're going to bring in the CBC's JP Tasker. He's been reporting on what comes next for the party and its leader, Pierre Poilievre, who lost his own seat. So, JP, if my phone is any indication, there's a lot of Conservatives with a lot of thoughts about what's going on. What's happening behind the scenes in your reporting here?
Yeah, my phone is blowing up today, making a lot of calls. I'm hearing from my Conservative sources that Pierre Poilievre is also on the phone, speaking to some caucus members, some close confidants, some party supporters, just trying to shore up his own leadership, but also get some direction on the way forward because, Monday's election was an uneven result in many respects, right? The party had major breakthroughs in the Greater Toronto area, as you've covered extensively. They're thrilled with what happened in other parts of Ontario. A lot of the NDP vote in some of the industrial centres going over to their side of the ledger. They're thrilled about that. Right. But they still lost 12 incumbents, David, right? And one of those incumbents, of course, was Pierre Poilievre himself. So there are some grumblings about the election result. They feel like they had victory in their hands that slipped through. So some people are not necessarily happy about that. So Poilievre just trying to do a temperature check, if you will, trying to see where things are at with the wider party. And I spoke to 3-4 caucus sources today about where things are at for him. And really what they're telling me is there is not a strong appetite for a leadership review at this point. There could be a Reform Act move against him like there was with Erin O'Toole. The caucus could adopt some of those powers under the legislation that gives them that ability to prompt a leadership review, but it seems like there really isn't a call for that right now, that there may be some grumblings, but it's really not something that they're seriously considering right now because there were those gains, because Poilievre did break through in the GTA where Andrew Scheer and Erin O'Toole fell flat, because Poilievre did hold the Liberals to a minority. Some folks are saying, you know what, let's give him another chance. We don't really want to go through a leadership review. What that kept coming up today in my conversation conversations. There is leadership fatigue, because they've had 4 leaders in 10 years, David, and there's really not a desire to spend time, money, and resources on going through another process to pick somebody else, especially when a lot of Conservatives are feeling a bit buoyant about Monday's results, feeling like they can get the Liberals the next time they get to that election, whenever it will be.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, Poilievre will be safe because he held them to a minority, but so did Aaron O'Toole and so did Andrew Scheer, and they never had a 25-point lead at any point in the polls going into that with this air of invincibility. So it speaks, I think, to how he did it, right? In that the breaking through in Ontario, as you talked about, southwestern Ontario, York region, the Peel region. So what are some next steps? I mean, the House of Commons is going to come back next month without Pierre Poilievre leading off question period, which is a unexpected outcome of this thing. But the Conservatives, as I understand it, have had one caucus meeting since Chrystia Freeland quit. So what are the next steps happening behind the scenes with the party?
Yeah, I'll just say, too, what's different. You mentioned those other leaders. What's different is the party base is really with Poilievre. Like, some folks have been speaking to their constituents. They've been speaking to organizers at the Electoral District Association level. Right. There is no strong appetite to get rid of Poilievre. The party base turned out for him, especially in some of those big rallies in the final week, David, when polls were pretty clear that McCartney and the Liberals were likely to win. He was still bringing in thousands of people, lots of merchandise being sold with his name on it. So MPs feeling like they don't necessarily want to move against somebody who has tremendous support from the caucus, from the grassroots, from the base. You mentioned the caucus. Yeah, I mean, this is what is the big question. Who will be the leader of the official opposition? Because it can't be Poilievre. By law, that has to be a sitting member of Parliament. So those conversations are ongoing. I'm told that there are some names that are being floated out, perhaps not a huge surprise. Melissa Lantsman, the current deputy leader, Michael Barrett, the ethics critic, Andrew Scheer, the former leader, and the current government House leader. Those are, or the House leader in the opposition. Those are a few of the options that are being considered. Why are they top of the list? Well, they're Poilievre loyalists, right? They have been absolutely behind Poilievre from the beginning, and they're only some of the few MPs that have been entrusted to speak publicly for the party before and during the election. So you get a sense of what Poilievre and his brain trust feel about them giving them that power, because not many people have that opportunity to speak publicly and freely. So we're keeping an eye on those 3. There could be others that emerge, of course. Poilievre doesn't necessarily dictate all of the terms of who will fill in for him in the House, but those are the people that are being considered. And they're also having conversations about a potential by-election, one caucus member stepping back to give Poilievre the opportunity to run in a potential by-election to get him back in the House. Very early conversations there, though. There's nothing decided at this point, I'm told.
Okay, JP Tasker, thanks for the time and good job on the reporting. Thanks. All right, this is CBC JP Tasker. Well, as Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre tries to shore up federal support, he's facing some criticism provincially. Nova Scotia Premier Tim Houston was asked today why he didn't campaign alongside Poilievre, and Houston confirmed there was a tense call, or at least text, with Poilievre's campaign manager, Jenny Byrne, who reportedly threatened Houston's political team.
I didn't have a relationship with him. I don't have a relationship with him. Obviously, during our campaign, there was a situation. I think the Globe story was pretty accurate. It's something that happened there that kind of probably had ramifications on both sides. I think the Conservative Party of Canada was very good at pushing people away, not so good at pulling people in, and I think that they probably saw that in some of the results they had across the country.
Well, Ontario Premier Doug Ford was out again today, and he also lobbed some criticism at Poilievre's campaign today when Ford was asked why he didn't back Poilievre.
I shouldn't interfere in the federal election. Last time I checked, Pierre Poilievre never came out in our election. Matter of fact, him or one of his lieutenants told every one of his members, "Don't you dare go out and help the PCs." Isn't that ironic? But anyways, I'm not going to dig deep into this. The people spoke, and I have no say in who people vote for. But I'll tell you one thing. We have a government, democratically elected. I will hold them accountable.
Okay, despite their issues with the Ford team, the federal Conservatives did gain seats in Ontario, but they were reduced to just one seat in Nova Scotia. They lost 2. The one they held is held by re-elected Conservative MP Chris D'Entremont, who represents the riding of Acadie, Annapolis, and Chris D'Entremont joins me now. Chris D'Entremont, it's good to see you. Thank you for being here today, sir.
Well, thanks for having me on.
I wonder what you make of what Tim Houston had to say today, saying that the federal Conservatives need to do some soul searching. I mean, was this why Rick Perkins and Steve Ellis lost their ridings in your province?
I don't think that was the sole reason, but I don't think it helped. We've said for a long time that conservatives are conservatives across the country. The same thing happens here in Nova Scotia. The branding might be a little bit different, but the volunteers are the same. The people working in the campaigns are the same. We have all kinds of MLAs coming out to help the conservative candidates. So in the background, we are all one. It just seems like in the front we can't seem to get that relationship to work correctly.
Right, but it's the front that sets the tone, it sets the style, it sets the the public-facing image that you present to the voters. And as a guy who grew up in Newfoundland and Labrador, Atlantic Canadian PCs are different than federal conservatives in a lot of ways. I mean, was that a factor in what happened in Nova Scotia, do you think?
I think it didn't help in getting Rick or Stephen elected. But like I say, I sat in the Nova Scotia legislature as a progressive conservative for 17 years, worked alongside Tim Houston. I know that my values are the same as Tim's values. I know that within the Conservative Party of Canada, that my values are echoed by many people there. And, quite honestly, when I see a little bit of that infighting going on, I don't want to make it the big story, but at the same time, I want to try to figure out the solution for it. I guess that's just my Nova Scotian in me, where I want people to be friends and try to figure out solutions so that we can move ahead to help the Nova Scotians and the Canadians that we're trying to do here.
Well, about that though, there has been either infighting or a lack of relationship building. Like when Pierre Poilievre finally called Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario said that's the first time the two have ever spoken, which seems remarkable that he had been a multi-year federal leader in Ontario and hadn't spoken to the Ontario Conservative leader. And we heard there from Premier Houston about the aggressive tactics that Jenny Byrne used in dealing with his chief of staff and I think his campaign manager as well. Is that the sort of thing your party needs to do if it's going to, win the fifth election or not lose the fifth election in a row potentially to the Liberals?
Well, ultimately, there has to be better relationships, and I think that's what I've been trying to do over the last number of years is try to get people to talk to each other. I don't think I've been that successful in it, but I think there's still time to pull it together. The other point that I need to make on this one is not only the relationships, but it's also the time that we spend here in Nova Scotia. Nova Scotians are not unlike Newfoundlanders as well, where we like to know the politicians that we're voting for. Yeah. And I think Pierre has to get out here and talk to Nova Scotians and get known better. And I think that's a challenge for Tour, and we only had him here for just a few minutes really on the Wednesday night, the last week of the election. We needed to have him here earlier, and I think that would have had a big impact on getting a couple of my colleagues elected, if not Alan McMaster or Bryson Jenkins. We had some great candidates running in Nova Scotia that really needed to have a little extra boost by the leader.
So where do you think this goes now? By all accounts, a 41% share of the popular vote. That's a tremendous success for the Conservatives. 144 seats, breaking through in key parts of Ontario, a tremendous success for the Conservatives. But Pierre Poilievre lost his seat, and down the stretch run, he wasn't in your ads, and he was seen as a bit of a ballot drag. So should he stay on as leader of your party after what happened on Monday night?
Well, I think you should. Ultimately, he won extra seats in the country. A lot of people that voted for me voted for change. They voted for Pierre Poilievre. Youth were voting for him. Young voters were voting for him. People concerned about the fishery were voting for him. And I think getting rid of him would be the bad message. The message that we've been trying to put, that we need change in Canada, in Nova Scotia, that it can be done by a Pierre Poilievre government. And I don't think we have time. How long are we going to be in a minority situation? How long before it falls again? Do we have time to do another leadership convention? Like you were saying earlier, we've had 4 leaders or 3 leaders in the last 4 years. We really need to stick to someone here, and I think Pierre's the guy.
Okay, but if you stick with the leader, do you stick with the leadership style? Because I don't think it's helpful to be fighting with Doug Ford. I don't think it's helpful to be fighting with Tim Houston. You've been at war with the Parliamentary Press Gallery, calling people liars because they get subsidies. Not you, I want to make that very clear. But this has been the thing that, because I work for the CBC and we get government money, we're going to lie for the government. It just creates all of these fractions and tensions and makes people question, the seriousness of things. So what needs to change in the approach and style of the party if you're going to keep Mr. Poilievre and make an even bigger breakthrough?
No, I think we still need to keep the government to account. I still think there's a place for a little of the attack where we need to bring these issues forward. But there also has to be a time where we sit down and work with other parties to make things work here in Canada. I think if anything we've learned over this election is the challenge that we're going to have working with our American president and how we're going to make Canada stronger. You know, that message was across all parties, and I think we need to find a way to work together in the House of Commons and in other places to put a strong front against that kind of challenge.
Okay, so, you know, I want to talk to you a bit about that, but the House of Commons. Come back in about a month. You were the Deputy Speaker. We ran a lot of clips of you on the show standing up and asking people to behave. You know, the House of Commons was not a productive place. It was at times a very toxic place. Committees were grossly useless in a lot of ways because it became super partisan and just about clips for social media. There was a story in the Toronto Star during this election that a handbook prepared by party staffers in the Conservative Party of how to make committees toxic and dysfunctional was there as like a guidebook to do that. Can Parliament come back in the shadow of a Trump presidency and function like it did, you know, when you last had the robes on and had to call for order during question period?
I don't think it should react like that. I think there has to be a better way to accomplish the things that we're all passionate about. You know, I really think it works both ways, though, in a lot of cases. A lot of the challenges that I would see as the Deputy Speaker of the House of Commons is the anger comes when we don't get an answer. So government has to answer things, you know, and then maybe the opposition might be less contrite in the way they ask their questions.
No, for sure, and I'm not absolving you know, the Liberals of their blame for this, but a handbook on how to make it messy is an interesting detail.
Never saw it.
Yeah. So just on that though, Chris D'Entremont, I mean, you know, you say this and you took that approach, you know, as Deputy Speaker in the House of Commons. This need to sort of change the approach, change the tone, be maybe a little bit less partisan all of the time. Is that a widespread sentiment in caucus? Is it a widespread sentiment in the party? Because you don't necessarily see that. Some of the rallies or the hardcore base is there.
Yeah, I don't think it is yet, but then again, we haven't sat down as a caucus in a while.
Yeah.
I think we all have to go sit down, find out what worked really well, what didn't work really well, and try to come up with a new plan. And I'm hoping that caucus will be a part of that decision making.
Okay, so Mr. Poilievre, he made it very clear in his speech, I think on Monday night, that he intends to stay on. When he said that, we did not know the result in Carleton, but he lost his seat. I don't know if you're willing to give up your seat for him with the margin from election night. I don't know if that's a good idea. But do you think a member of the caucus will give up their seat for Mr. Poilievre reasonably quickly so he can seek a by-election and try to get back in? How do you think that will develop?
No, I mean, I don't see any other option at this point that someone's going to have to give up their seat. You know, it's unfair in a way because they just ran an election or 36 days, you know, coming into the same situations that I was coming into, you know, and some of them have been actually running, campaigning for many, many months prior to this. But at the same time is that we need to have Pierre in the House of Commons, and the only way to do that is to have some kind of by-election, which could be called 9 months down the road.
Yeah.
You know, it's going to be taking a challenge where we're not going to have the leader in the chamber. So it's going to ask, you know, that's going to be questions of who is going to end up being the leader there, who's going to be asking Mark Carney the tough questions.
Okay, and just as a final point, I mean, I wonder, we talked about tone and things like this, but the staff around Mr. Poilievre, I mean, the fact that you and I are talking on this show, this is something we've not seen on this show in a couple of years. Not you, but just Conservative MPs in general. Do you and the rest of the caucus need to be freed up to actually speak to media, do community debates, you know, reach out and present yourself to Canadians in ways other than just through the leader? And what do you make of these calls for people like senior staff like Jenny Byrne or senior advisors like Jenny Byrne to be let go?
Well, you know, I think we do have to do a better job of being seen. You know, we're a great team of conservatives from coast to coast to coast that have a lot of great ideas that want to do great things for this country. And I think getting out here and talking to shows like yours and talking to shows across the country is going to be extremely important to get that message out, because people, you know, at this point, in some cases, didn't hear it. So we need to do better work on that side.
And what about the calls for people like Jenny Byrne to be let go? Are you satisfied that she stays part of the leadership team of the party, or do you think you need fresh leadership around the leader should he stay?
I'll look forward to my conversation with the other caucus members.
Okay, well, Chris D'Entremont, we'll leave it there, and hopefully we can have future conversations on this topic. That's Chris D'Entremont, Conservative MP from Acadie in Nova Scotia. Thank you, sir. It's good to see you.
See ya.
Okay. All right, we're going to pick up there with the panel. Carleen Verheyen, Tim Powers, Jordan Leichnitz, and Sherelle Evelyn. Tim,
Surprised you're coming to me first.
well, you're another Atlantic Canadian Tory, so I
With a
figure
little
you
bit
have
of
some
shrapnel
insight
in
on
my
that.
back from
But
the Polyev team.
like Chris D'Entremont, comes from that Atlantic conservative tradition, like David Brazel, who ran in St. John's East, who I knew very well from his time as the leader of the PC party, big supporter of public broadcasting, someone who talks to the media and stuff all the time. He didn't win because of just the sea change that happened out there. But just what do you make of where they are in terms of the decisions? Because it can go one of two ways. They can be completely encouraged by the results and blame the circumstances of Trump and NDP and bloc collapse, or they can say, well, the leader lost his seat and hit a ceiling with women, and that means we got to change. Where do you think it goes?
Well, shiny silver medals are nice, David, but gold is what the modern Conservative Party was set up for to do by Stephen Harper and Peter MacKay. It wasn't to have the great, respectable second place finish where you can talk about your key performance indicators that didn't get you across the finish line. And look, there's enough people around who know that and who will bring that forward in their discussions with Pierre. I think a number of things. Let me try and be quick with them. One, I think Pierre Poilievre is in a better position than Andrew Scheer and Aaron O'Toole.
Oh, without question. Without question.
But I still do not think he has it locked. And he should not assume he has it locked, nor should his team. He's either at 50-50 or 60-40 at staying and or going. I think what he does from this day forward, right through the summer, is important. He might want to borrow a page from Stephen Harper, who was the only other leader of the modern Conservative Party to be given a second chance. After Mr. Harper lost to Mr. Martin in 2004, they did a long and thorough and unencumbered autopsy of what went wrong. What did they do? They changed their approach to managing the party. They brought in people like Doug Findlay, who became a bit of an iconic figure in the Conservative Party because he, Ian Brody, and another fellow by the name of Patrick Moutart helped Stephen Harper build a team, helped Stephen Harper change his approach, helped Stephen Harper go on the path to winning three governments in a row. JP talked about the base. That's a real interesting point, and JP is not wrong in saying the base, but it's a base that Pierre, Jamil Giovanni have defined as purist. You're not going to win the country if you only have so-called purists.
Yeah.
As Tim Houston has said, as Doug Ford has said, the Conservative Party, and Chris said it there too, has to be bigger than that. So all of that is vital. The last thing I'd say, because I know you want to move on, is that yes, staffing needs to be looked at, but it's not, look, to be fair to Jenny Byrne, she's but one person. Ultimately, the leader himself decides what tone is acceptable,
100%.
what approach is acceptable,
100%.
and he himself has to demonstrate in the feedback that he's going to get, he's getting a lot of feedback, that he's prepared to grow. He has tremendous skills, but he needs more. And will he grow and accept that advice?
Yeah, look, and I'm not trying to scapegoat Jenny Byrne.
No, I know you're not. I'm just making that
when
broader
multiple
point.
premiers are naming her,
Of course, yeah.
as a thing, it makes you wonder about things. So, Sherelle, it's interesting that Chris D'Entremont just did an interview on power and politics. They didn't do a lot of local interviews to candidates in the campaign. They didn't do any debates, really, though David Brazel, who I mentioned, did do a CBC debate because, he knows his local market. Leaders are central to the campaign, but it was the only thing on offer in the Conservative campaign. Like, who was the finance minister going to be? Who was the foreign? I don't know. I mean, what do you make of how the caucus is feeling now that they went along with it, but they lost and the leader lost his seat?
Yeah, well, and that's part of what that soul searching is going to have to be. It's like, on election night, Pierre Poilievre, he said that, we have to learn lessons about what happens to figure out how to move forward and get a better result next time. So it kind of depends on what lessons are they going to be taking away. Are they going to be thinking, well, clearly we were too nice and we need to, go deeper on the ideological purity
I don't think
angle.
it'll be that way.
Or are they going to say to themselves, okay, well, that didn't work, and this is what we need to do going forward? Will the caucus have that have that voice to say, you know what, we would like to see some change and we would hope that you're going to listen to us on this. Because there are some very, very good communicators in the Conservative caucus, but a lot of them have been either silenced or they've been reduced to simply, when they do get to communicate, simply repeating the leader's talking points and mirroring and mimicking his voice. Because as we've heard and as your colleagues here have reported, that's how they get, rewards through the leader's office. The more that they are able to mimic, the more that they are able to repeat, the more that they're able to use the slogans and attack, that's how they are able to progress. So if that expectation can be put away, then I think there's a better shot. But from what we're hearing, that there isn't really right now that appetite within caucus to turf the leader, because yes, they did make incredible gains, but ultimately, Pierre Poilievre's favorability, it was always not great. It was always lower than even Prime Minister Trudeau's former Prime Minister Trudeau's in terms of what people across the country thought about him as a person. He was he very approachable? All that people didn't like him.
Yeah.
So.
And he got really unpopular with women during the campaign.
Yeah.
And that gender gap was profound. Right?
Exactly, and it only got worse as time went on. So. How do you now kind of spread that wealth around a bit to make sure that people are seeing what it is that you're selling and not just who the seller is?
So Jordan, if the caucus does want change, they'll never have more leverage than they have right now, where one of them has a seat he's going to want, though I think it might be reasonably easy for him to find, but do they want him to move on to Alberta, or does he want to find somewhere here in Ontario? I'm not sure how it's going to go, but Conservatives are being much more visible in Canadian media on a backbench level than they have been for quite some time.
That's a huge change. And I mean, look, power is a great form of discipline, right? And so when the Conservatives were 25 points ahead and it looked like that they were going to sail into majority government, there was every incentive for all members of the Conservative team to follow the line, to follow the leader, to obey all of those demands from the central office. That's gone now because that didn't work. And I think the question that I have about it is, Cheryl makes a good point about the potential of Poilievre and the leadership taking a new tact in order to learn from this, but do we know if he's capable of doing that? Because he is a singular type of leader who has a really specific vision about the type of Conservative he is, the type of Conservative party he wants to lead, and it is very leader-centric. So one of the things that we observed during the campaign was his difficulty in adapting to new situations as they arose on the campaign, his difficulty in moderating. And I don't think that personality has changed at all between now and then. So that will remain a big challenge for him.
Yeah, and like we saw with Houston and Ford, Carleen, and with a lot of the candidates who wanted to run and were rejected, like Eric Girard, the finance minister in Quebec, is that purity test and loyalty test got applied.
Totally.
And that backfired in a lot of ridings and caused a lot of bad blood. So just your thoughts. I'm over there.
Well, there's one thing that's kind of been bugging me, David, that I want to come back to. And, I'm obviously not a Conservative insider, but as a woman organizer in
politics. There's only about 3 of them.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. But as a woman organizer who's been in politics for over 20 years, I feel like I've seen this movie before. When Pierre Poilievre was rising to his 25-point lead and measuring the drapes at 24 Sussex or wherever the Prime Minister lives now, he was getting all of the credit. The moment that things started to crumble, who did the knives come out for? His campaign manager, Jenny Byrne. I don't necessarily believe that that's fair. I haven't really liked watching the way that people have been so willing to absolve the leader of responsibility, and I'm talking about statements that we've seen come out from notable Conservatives in the last 48 hours, but be so quick to put his campaign manager, Jenny Byrne, on trial. And these websites we've seen like firejennyburn.com. I mean, it's just a little gross. And so I don't love seeing that. I also think that it is interesting to note, when you spoke to Chris a moment ago, he talked about the different shades of blue values and said, I share a lot of values with Premier Tim Houston. He didn't say that he shared a lot of values with Pierre Poilievre, and I thought that was a notable.
Well, he might have been trying to build a bridge back to the Nova Scotia PC, so that
he
could
might have been.
it.
But when you rule with an iron fist and with, demanding a blind loyalty, and you do that because you're able to offer the promise of bringing the Conservatives back from the wilderness, finally beating the Liberals after 9 years. It works until it doesn't. And I don't think that we've seen the end of dissatisfied Conservatives who don't feel that they got what they signed up for.
Yeah, and blaming the staff is a good point because, you know, Justin Trudeau kept everyone in the PMO there and people would complain about the staff, but he was still ultimately responsible for what happened in his office, just like it is Mr. Poilievre. Tim, quick, because I got to get to a guest.
Just very quickly off of what Carleen said, I agree with everything you've said, but there's also a huge cultural challenge. It's not just about the personality. That anger and grievance culture, he harvested to great effect. So part of the transition is going to be, can one professionalize? Can one build off hope and opportunity? Doesn't mean you can't criticize the Liberals. Doesn't mean you can't be forceful on conservative values, but you can't be angry all the time. Ultimately, to
Especially
win in
out
Canada,
east.
yeah, but to win across Canada, anger doesn't win. Jamal Giovanni did not help the Federal Conservative Party last night by playing into this, or 2 nights ago by going off on Doug Ford, because Jamal's a good man, but when people, when people see that, that is what they think of the Conservative Party. If you're not part of them, you're not in. And that will not win elections for the Federal Conservative Party.
No, but it was a heck of a moment when he talked to David Common
great
the other
TV
night.
for David.
I got to say. Okay, we're going to park that for a second, and we're going to turn from the Liberals and the Conservatives to focus on the New Democrats, who fared a lot worse with voters on Election Day. New Democrats received around 1.2 million votes. That is just 6.3% of the vote. This translated into the NDP losing 17 seats in the House of Commons. They managed to hold on to just 7 seats. And one of those 7 seats belongs to one of the remaining MPs. That's Heather McPherson, the first re-elected NDP MP for the riding of Edmonton-Strathcona. And Heather McPherson is going to join me now. Heather McPherson, it's good to see you. Thank you for being here. I know that was a disappointing result for you, your caucus, your leader the other night. What message do you take from what happened?
Well, yeah, it was a disappointing night. Of course it was for all of us. We had hoped to bring more New Democrats to Ottawa, and so yeah, we were disappointed. That said, I think we all know that this election was very unique. It was an election that was based on fear. People were choosing to stop things from happening rather than to vote to build something. And frankly, sometimes that's not easy for New Democrats. You know, this was something where we heard time and time again from the Liberals, that same old playbook where they say, you know, we need you to vote for us to stop the scary Conservatives. And what happened in a lot of seats, certainly in my province, is that they got Conservatives and they split the vote. It's
interesting, though, in places like here in Ontario, southwestern Ontario, you know, a lot of the NDP vote went blue, right? They abandoned sort of the party traditionally associated with Labour, but went to a party that's been aggressively courting private sector union workers. I mean, what does that say to you about where the core constituency is for your party right now? If the Liberals can get a lot of urban progressives, but then the Conservatives can get sort of the working class trade union sort of voter. Oh, you know, I still believe that the New Democrats are, of course, the party for the working class. We are, of course, the party for workers. You know, it is true that with a ton of money and a lot of advertising, Pierre Poilievre tried to cosplay as a working man, and I think people are going to see through that, and that's not going to be the reality. And you know, we're going to come back. We're going to be stronger. The New Democrats have 7 of us going to Ottawa, and we wish there were a lot more. But those 7 are some of the fiercest, strongest members of Parliament in the last Parliament, and we are going to hold the government to account, and we are going to show Canadians that what we need right now more than ever is a Democratic Party, a new Democratic Party that you know, does hold the government responsible, that isn't just there to pick fights and make slogans and do rhyming, but is actually going to hold the government accountable to the promises that they made to Canadians. But you're going to hold the government accountable, but without official party status, with the loss of your leader, without the leverage of the supply and confidence agreement. You know, what holds a minority government, I guess, to account is the threat of the parliament falling and going to an election. I don't think there's any real appetite for that. So, I mean, how do you see that happening in this new parliament when you won't even be guaranteed an opportunity to ask a question in question period every day or a seat on a committee? Yeah, I mean, David, listen, we've got our work set out for us, absolutely. But don't forget, there were 25 of us in the last Parliament, and we got dental care through. We got a pharmacare framework through. We got anti-scab legislation through. You know, we pushed the government to do so many things with 25, and absolutely, it's going to be a lot of work. But
people don't become New Democrats because they're afraid of work.
Sure.
We're fighters, and we're going to come back, and we're going to be there, and we're going to be in Ottawa. We do have the balance of power. We do have the ability to make sure that the government is doing things for Canadians. I'm worried about McPherson. I'm worried about having a banker that maybe doesn't understand how difficult it is for Canadians right now, how difficult it is for them to afford housing, how difficult it is for them to afford groceries. And that's where New Democrats belong. That's why we need to be there. And, Canadians don't want a two-party electoral system. We've seen how this has worked out in the United States, and it's terrible. It makes everyone divisive. It pushes people to the edges. What we need is parliamentarians that are willing to roll up their sleeves and get to work. And we need a three-party or multiple-party system in this country to have a strong democracy where there is collaboration, there is working together, there's getting things done for Canadians. That's what Canadians need.
Right, but I appreciate your argument, but 85% voted for those two parties if you add it all up. And in a reasonably high turnout election, I know there are circumstantial reasons for that, but a lot of working-class Canadians do seem to believe that either Pierre Poilievre or McPherson does, even if they don't in their gut understand what they're going through, they trust them to find the solution, right? That's the message I take from this. So, why do you think they didn't look at Jagmeet Singh, who certainly has empathy and campaign with good humor, not as the solution? This is the problem. The New Democrats got very much squeezed out because for some reason it wasn't the life raft people were looking for in this crisis.
Well, and I think that comes down to that thing where we talked about the fear election. This is a Donald Trump election. So we had Liberals telling Canadians that they had to vote Liberal so that they could keep out Pierre Poilievre and deal with Donald Trump. And then we had other folks that were very, very worried about a fourth term for a Liberal government that had seen their cost of living go up, had seen the cost of groceries go up, had seen, no steps taken to protect the healthcare system, all of those pieces. So I think in this election, what we saw was people making those choices. I don't think it's a reality for the New Democratic Party going forward. I think we are going to rebuild as a party. We've been in situations like this before. We will rebuild. We will come forward with propositions that Canadians can believe in. I'm excited. Honestly, we are going to have a leadership race. And leadership races are a moment where the party can talk about the values that we have, where we can bring New Democrats from across the country together, where we can have some of those conversations and build that excitement that we need to have to start to rebuild our party. We've got two jobs to do in Ottawa this Parliament. We have to hold the government accountable. We have to be a strong opposition. And we have to get more New Democrats elected in the next Parliament.
Right. Well, your caucus needs to get together and figure out who the interim leader will be, and then you move on to the process of permanent leader. Do you want to be the permanent leader of the party? Will you run for the leadership?
Our caucus is going to meet tomorrow. We're going to have some conversations. I've heard from a number of different people that have asked me to consider it, and I haven't had time. I just haven't had the time to really think that through, to talk to my family, to talk to all of the people that I would need to speak to. So I can't answer that question right now.
Okay. All right. Well, look, just one last question then. There has been this duality of sort of the urban progressive cohort of the party and sort of that working class cohort of the party. Yeah. Can the NDP stay in both of those lanes? Do you need to sort of get back to more of a traditional class-based party, sort of what the NDP was, or do you need to steer more into the sort of left-leaning progressive value set?
I don't think we've ever left I don't think that's ever changed. We've always been the party that's been trying to make life more affordable, make life better for Canadians.
Sure, but there's a tension between those two. There's a tension between those two issues at times, right? And between the focuses of what a working class voter wants and maybe what an urban, sort of progressive may be looking for, from their leader. And do you need to recalibrate that balance, I wonder?
I don't think so. I think, honestly, what we need to be focusing on right now, I think about this a lot, but the election was on Monday night. Well, Tuesday morning, Canadians could still, we're still struggling to buy groceries. On Tuesday morning, there still was no rent protection for people in Alberta. On Tuesday morning, there was a housing crisis and there was a threat of privatization in our healthcare system. So that's why New Democrats have to be there. And that's not an urban-rural, that's not there's no divide there. That's what all Canadians need New Democrats to be fighting for.
Okay. NDP MP Heather McPherson, thanks for speaking with us today. And congratulations on your re-election and good luck with the tough work ahead. Thanks so much. All right, that's NDP MP Heather McPherson. We're going to go back to the panel. And Tim, guess who I'm starting with this time?
Oh, good.
It's going to be Jordan.
Is that Tim?
No, it's not Tim. Jordan, you know, I know it's been a tough week, right? Like Mel Riche is a panelist as well and a good friend, and she was with Jagmeet Singh to the bitter end. And, you know, there's a lot of loss there, though he campaigned with great spirit right up until the bitter end, was dignified in his speech on Monday night. But, like, what the heck does the party need to do now? I know there's optimism about a rebuild, but that's not guaranteed just because it happened in the 90s.
Yeah, I mean, look, the results are devastating, and I don't think it serves anybody to understate that. To be shut out of Ontario for the first time since the late 90s, this is a huge problem for the party. I think that, you know, it's correct to say that there are external factors that conditioned this election that were really unique. So the Trump factor and also Poilievre as a push factor for a lot of progressive voters. But we did lose votes to the Conservatives, particularly in key areas in southwestern Ontario. And we have to look at why. And I think there are a few reasons for that. Those voters tend to be voters that are concerned with affordability issues, cost of living, things like housing, strong healthcare system. Those are issues that really resonate with them. Well, over the last couple of years, the Conservatives were very successful in connecting with those voters. They spent a great deal of money to do that. They also spent a great deal of money to attack Jagmeet Singh and the NDP and undermine that connection
Right, $3
with
million
those
bucks,
voters.
right?
Exactly. So I think that played a part in it. I mean, it is true to say that the NDP campaigned very much on those issues, but their megaphone was very small leading up to the election. They were not able to compete in paid media leading into the campaign, which left them at a real disadvantage. So part of it is making sure that it's very clear when the NDP speaks to working class voters what their priorities are. And that does mean that there is sometimes some tension with those issues that excite the activist base, but confuse that message with those voters. And so that is going to have to be part of the party's conversation in rebuilding.
But like, I have a question. Like Heather McPherson mentioned it there about rent, and Jagmeet Singh was promising national rent control. You can't do that. Like, you need the provinces to do that. Like, that's a provincial issue,
but
right?
David, most voters are not walking around with a copy of the Constitution to understand the separation of powers,
I understand
right?
that. But you know, if you're going to be credible in a pitch for government, you have to have issues you can implement, right?
I think that the challenge was less specific policy issues. In fact, if you look at the polling, a lot of the policy issues and the things the NDP raised were resonating with voters. That wasn't why voters moved away. The reason that voters moved away is because they didn't view the NDP as a viable vehicle to stop Pierre Poilievre or to deal with the affordability issues if they were more sort of NDP conservative switch voters. So those are the two challenges that the party has in front, is addressing those. And absolutely, vote splitting is a problem for the NDP. But the very best way for the NDP to defeat the strategic vote argument that the Liberals advance every campaign is to get back in the business of winning the popular vote.
Right. Yeah.
So that is the thing that will make the party able to defeat those strategic vote arguments, is becoming more electorally viable in all of those regions.
Yeah, I mean, Sherelle, this is the argument Brad Levine was making, that the party needs to decide, do you want to just have balance of power, be a conscious, or try to win, like Jack Layton was intent on when they had their breakthrough in 2011.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there was a lot of talk about the external factors and all that. But I mean, Jagmeet Singh himself, he said that, you know, yeah, we could have gone to an election back when the Conservatives wanted it, but, you know, I put Canada first over the party. And, you know, during the campaign, when it, you know, things were obviously weren't looking great, he said, well, let's not give McCartney all the power. So it wasn't necessarily a firebrand pitch to people in terms of getting that popular vote, in terms of getting that, you know, vote for us because we want to win, as opposed to let's do the most that we can to hold the government to account and get people what they need. I do think that it was, you know, it was very commendable throughout the course of, you know, Jagmeet Singh's tenure. His push was always, let's help people. And I'm not necessarily here to say I'm going to be prime minister all the time. That's not always the message that he was giving, but I want to do what I can and use the power that I have to get people the help that they need. And they did that. And they're right. Yes, they had 25 MPs and they got, you know, really important gains for people, but they weren't able to capitalize on it. And now, yes, they can do the work in terms of, you know, having the balance of power, helping Liberals get things over the line by pushing their own agenda. But without official party status, that's going to be a lot more difficult. You don't have the financial resources, you don't have the seats on committees, you're basically there on everybody else's good graces of getting them to allow you to speak or allow you to put forward, amendments and things on bills and committees and those types of things. So there are lots of procedural things that are going to make it a lot more difficult with having such a small group. I'm not saying that they're not competent, because they are incredibly competent people who were elected, but it is going to be that much more difficult.
Yeah, there's a sort of like a tragic irony in all of this, Carleen. Cheryl Oates and Anne McGrath have made the point on the show that, Jagmeet Singh, if you just look at the 7 seats, you look at the political defeat here, but on a policy front, very consequential in those, getting the implementation of those programs in the Supply and Confidence Agreement. But, they kept the Liberals alive long enough for them to reorganize and rebuild, and then ultimately, push them down to this level by winning this election. Because Mr. Singh was right in his diagnosis that if he had given Pierre Poilievre the election when he wanted it, it was going to be a commanding Conservative majority.
It sure was. And look, I mean, I have a lot of empathy and sympathy for where the NDP sit. I remember sitting on shows just like this in the time following 2011, when the Liberal Party was reduced to third party in that election, when Harper got his majority, and people were openly questioning whether the Liberal Party would fall apart.
You were gone forever, never to come back.
Never to come back.
4 governments later.
So I'm here to say to my NDP friends, there is hope, and there will be a new tomorrow. But in all seriousness, I do think the challenges are real. Sometimes having a real moment like this, though, can be the catalyst to take a harder look at the changes that might need to be made than you might otherwise if you were just facing a smaller setback. Sort of that idea that you need to burn it down to be able to build it all back up again. There's another administrative difficulty too that I think is interesting. Just looking at the initial Elections Canada results on their website earlier today, I noticed that there were a lot of NDP candidates who failed to meet that 10% threshold that Elections Canada requires in order to get the Elections Canada rebate. And that is worth a ton of money. Like I think there was something like 80% of the candidates failed to reach that threshold.
I hadn't looked at that. That's a very good point.
That can be like $2, $3, $4 million bucks of money, and that financial challenge could also present a challenge to the party in terms of its ability to actually hold the Liberal government to account. So it's not a clear path.
Yeah, especially since they often remortgage the Jack Layton building to help pay for elections. So, Jordan, you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think one of the other important pieces of context for this, and particularly when we're talking about those blue-orange voters in southwestern Ontario, is, the federal Conservatives don't have the same relationship with organized labor that the provincial PCs do. So it's not a one-to-one on that. The provincial Conservatives have really invested a lot of time and a lot of resources in courting certain large private sector unions. That is not the case federally. The federal Conservatives did not receive any large endorsements from major private sector unions. And the other thing to point out too is that for the NDP provincially, they still hold all those seats, right? London, Windsor, Hamilton, you have Niagara. So there are strong roots there for the party to fall back on. And I think that there's going to be important conversations, not just in Ontario, but across the country with those provincial sections where they are in official opposition, in government. They are competing and winning in those elections, and there's a lot to be learned there.
Yeah, Tim, I don't know what to make of the value of union endorsements. I'm not an anti-union guy. I'm in a union myself. But there's what the union leadership says, and then there's what the union membership does, right? Like Lana Payne was with Mark Carney as on his advisory council. The auto belt went blue. You know what I mean? And Unifor represents so much of the workers down there. So I don't know.
You're asking me this, Jordan. I'm still mad at Jordan over the whole tax havens argument. So I'm going to give you a really good.
Tim's our union steward.
I don't think, joking aside, endorsements don't really mean much anymore in anything. It's like the old days. Oh, such and such a paper endorsed us. Oh, that must mean we will win. That doesn't matter anymore. What matters is whether people who give you those endorsements lend their people and their
labor and their money and their time.
But I would just say the NDP and Conservatives are similar in this approach, is in that they both need to know what it is they are representing and who they appeal to. The challenge is more acute for the NDP right now, but the reality is Canada needs an NDP. It needs that third voice because there is a space, as has been proven at different levels out there. But the NDP has a bigger challenge than the Conservatives now. That isn't the 7 or 8 seats they have. It's what is it we want to sell to people? Sherelle makes a good argument, as Mr. Singh did, about we're there to help people. Well, guess what? You can help more people if you're in power, and you do that. But there is still a large chunk of the NDP that Jordan knows better than I that are okay with being the conscience. I think you live in an era, though, particularly with young voters, where they want the conscience and they want the outcome. And until the NDP find a way of delivering that and using language, much like Mr. Poilievre has used to connect with young people around their affordability issues, the NDP need the language that connects with affordability and conscience. Mr. Singh was a good communicator, but I don't think he had that etymology with him.
Okay. We got to let the etymology phrase be the last word here because we got to take a break. So I want to thank the Power panel, Carleen Bryan, Tim Powers, Jordan Leichnitz, and Sherelle Evelyn. There is still lots more to come on Power and Politics. The Green Party, well, it received its fewest votes in 25 years and now only has 1 seat. The leader and sole seat holder, Elizabeth May, is standing by to talk about the party's future. And they say when the U.S. sneezes, Canada catches a cold. Well, the U.S. economy is flashing red warning signs and has a big runny nose. And we're going to talk to an economist about the risks to Canada. And the Power Rankings panel is here to give us their picks for who is up and who is down in Canadian politics today. Election night started with a victory for the Green Party when Elizabeth May was re-elected to her 5th term in her British Columbia riding.
But it looks like we'll go back into the House of Commons with a minority where we can make a difference, with me as leader of the Green Party, with a Prime Minister I've known for a few decades, and we've started off nicely tonight. What can I say?
But after all the votes were counted, May remained the only Green MP elect. The party ended up with just under 250,000 votes across the entire country, making up just 1.2% of the vote share, the party's worst vote share in 25 years. And this morning, Jonathan Pedno announced he is stepping down as co-leader, writing, "I recognize that we were not able to break through in a way that could shift the course of our country, and that is a responsibility I must carry." So where does the Green Party stand? Well, Elizabeth May is the remaining Green Party leader and Green Party MP, and she joins me now. Ms. May, it's good to see you. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks, David.
Jonathan Pedno, he has chosen to step down as co-leader. What does this mean for the party now?
Well, I really disagree with Jonathan's statement. That's not a responsibility for him to carry. I've gone through, this was my 6th federal election, and most of them when I was leader of the Green Party of Canada, and then at the 2021 I wasn't, and this time with co-leader Jonathan Pedno, I've experienced what it's like when we're kicked out of the debates versus when we're in the debates. It has a big effect on vote share, and we really don't, once you're not in the debates, it's like you're almost erased from media coverage. That's not, I think Jonathan took on too much of that for himself, and I know how hard he worked and that he is a voice that will be missed.
Right.
Canadian politics. I was unsuccessful in convincing him to stay, but look, this was a weird election, David. I don't think anyone will disagree. I was watching earlier. I'm so glad Heather McPherson was re-elected in her riding as an NDP. A lot of good friends of mine in other parties lost their seats, but I never thought Mike Morris in Kitchener Centre would lose his seat. He's done such a great job. So there are hard lessons here, but overall, this election was strange, to put it mildly, as it was covered as though we were in an election to elect a prime minister, which we don't do in Canada.
Well, I mean, but that's
a 2-horse race.
But that is how, I mean, 85% of the vote went to 2 parties, and that is how Canadians were viewing it. I mean, you got 31,000 votes, which was like 1/8 of all the votes your party got nationally. And I know getting kicked out of the debates is frustrating, but it was prompted in large part by a decision to drop candidates for strategic voting reasons and not getting them there, right?
We didn't make that decision. That was incorrect reporting, and it did not happen. And we wrote the Debates Commission, and they understood the day before. It was explained to them clearly. Actually, there's no Debates Commission because there is no Debates Commissioner. There is a senior person left on staff who made those decisions, and those need to be revisited because we're going to be into another election, probably, obviously, sooner than if it was a majority parliament. So we're getting ready. We know it's a minority parliament. I look forward, as I said in that clip there, I had a conversation with the Prime Minister the night of the election to congratulate each other. Obviously, huge turnaround in fortunes for the Liberal Party.
Sure.
And Prime Minister Carney has a challenging parliament ahead. And we need to make sure it works because Canada has to stick together to take on Donald Trump. It's not like one person can be a savior for a country. We need, Team Canada, elbows up, and we have to work together.
Right, but it is a minority, but it seems more durable than most minorities because Mr. Poilievre lost his seat. The NDP are without party status and without their leader, and none of those parties. Well, I can't speak for the Conservatives. It doesn't seem like the New Democrats will be keen, and Mr. Blanchet has said he'll for at least a year. There's going to be some stability here, but the lessons for the Green Party. I mean. Annemie Paul was in, then she was out, replaced you. We broadened it out to Jonathan Pedno. The debate thing was the debate thing, but he is now gone. You're back as the sole leader and the sole MP. The New Democrats say they can rebuild, and they point to the fact that they're in government in BC, opposition in Alberta, opposition in Saskatchewan, government in Manitoba. They have a regional base to build from. What does this mean for the Greens? I mean, the vote share's just gone down consistently. How do you come back?
Again, this was not unexpected when we had such difficulty getting all of our nominated candidates onto the ballot. That was not a decision. That was a struggle given if Bill C-65, for instance, that died on the order paper, which would have reformed the process of collecting signatures, we would have had very close to a full slate. I mean, I'm not going to look in the rearview mirror and say, if only, if only, if only. your question for the future, yes, we'll rebuild. We have elected Greens in 4 provinces
But
across
every
Canada.
party had to deal with that, Ms. May. Like every party had to deal with those. Every party had to deal with those same rules,
But
right?
they had buckets of David. They had buckets of money. They could pay people to collect signatures. We didn't. We were relying on volunteers up against very short timelines, with rules and with a political climate, by the way, that had really changed. We've never before had volunteers letting us know we're not prepared to go out and collect signatures anymore because we don't feel safe. We feel physically threatened and harassed. We've never experienced that before.
But physically threatened and harassed by whom? Like I've heard that Mr. Pedno say that, but I don't understand who was threatening them.
Actually, on the street, and this is a report that came from across the country from our volunteers. We put out a press release about it April 8th. I reported to the Privy Council office and the CSIS folks when I was getting my top secret security clearance on how the election was going. And I told them there, please tell the Commissioner of Elections Canada, we've written them too, we need to make reforms before the next election because we've never experienced anything like this in terms of, in some places, it was just the skepticism of why do you want my name and my address and want me to sign something? I've never run into that before, but across the country, people are more cautious. Society is more fractured. Collecting signatures was much harder, and we had a lot of returning officers, some of whom weren't clear on the rules, sent people away, they were wrong, people had to come back. We would have had a lot more people on the ballot and a lot more of the popular vote if, for instance, just one clear example, I mean, if Mark Carney had decided on March 23rd to ask the Governor General to drop the writ and have the election take place May 5th instead of April 28th, and I'm not blaming him, it's just we thought it was going to go for May 5th because who would want to have advanced polling starting on Good Friday and Easter Saturday and so on. As it turned out, that didn't affect advanced voting. We had big turnout for advanced polling. But the reality is that squeezed us out of another week. We could have collected more signatures, had more candidates on the ballots. We wanted a full slate. We had candidates nominated across the country, which isn't nothing to have a full slate because we vet every candidate. They have to be nominated. And that met the rules of the Debates Commission. And we will unfortunately not be able to get that revisited. The election is over.
Right.
We will rebuild. We are in Parliament. Not every party that runs across the country elects anyone. Obviously, Max Bernier is disappointed the People's Party didn't. The NDP to go down to 7 seats from where they were before. This was an election that squeezed the smaller parties a lot. And we're not gone. We're not dead. We're already writing all of our candidates and saying, okay, we know an election's coming up sooner than later, which is not an advantage we had from 2021. Now we have the advantage of being able to say, okay, let's talk to all the candidates. Are you willing to run again? Are you ready? I'm hearing from so many people. They're going to get organized. They're going to be ready for the next election. So we will elect a lot more Greens in the next election. And in the meantime, the job isn't, and for me, my sense of my duty is to my country, my planet, and my community to continue to be the best MP I possibly can be for the voters of Saanich Gulf Islands, who, and it's very personal, they did me this extraordinary honor of asking to continue to serve. But
just as a final question, Ms. May, like you say you will elect a lot more Greens, but that's kind of never really happened, right? I know Mike Morris was there. And he lost. I'm not trying to be mean, but I'm just trying to be analytical at this. Like Mike Morris won. He was a good MP. He seems like a really good person. But the disqualification essentially of the Liberal candidate in that riding after some journalistic work by my colleague Ashley Burke took Raj Saini out of there, changed the dynamic of that race, and now it's back to you. So I guess.
Let's look at the reality.
But does the Green Party of Canada survive in Parliament beyond Elizabeth May's political career? Because we always seem to end up in a circumstance like this at some point.
No, what we need to do, and the NDP need to help, and Mark Carney needs to help, we need fair voting. We need to get rid of first past the post, which is what drives people to fear-based voting. Your last panel was talking about it, the strategic voting panic. We do not need fear-based voting. We need people voting for what they want. And we need to have a voting system like most democracies around the world. The vast majority won't touch first past the post with a 10-foot pole. We need to go back to, how was it that Justin Trudeau got a majority in 2015?
Right.
Making a promise he broke. And we need to absolutely ensure fair voting in this country before we end up having someone who's a Canadian version of Trump getting 100% of the power with less than 40% of the popular vote.
Okay. Elizabeth May, congratulations on winning your seat. It's good to talk to you again. That's Green Party leader Elizabeth May. Thank you for being here today.
And you couldn't be mean if you tried, David Cochrane. A good Newfoundlander like you could not be mean. I'm sorry.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We'll leave it there. Elizabeth May, thank you for your time today. All right, still ahead, the U.S. economy just shrank for the first time in more than 3 years when the world was still grappling with a pandemic. Up next, an economist tells us he's officially on recession watch, and I'll ask him what that means for Canada. The impact of U.S. President Donald Trump's tariffs may be rearing their ugly head on the American people. New numbers out today show the U.S. economy shrank by 0.3% in the first quarter of this year, and that hasn't happened in 3 years. U.S. President Donald Trump is putting the blame on his predecessor.
That's Biden. That's not Trump, because we came in on January, this is quarterly numbers, and we came in and I was very against everything that Biden was doing in terms of the economy.
So could this GDP contraction be the start of a U.S. recession? Justin Wolfers is a professor of public policy and economics at the University of Michigan and non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. Justin Wolfers, it's good to see you. Thank you for being here today, sir.
A pleasure, mate.
So the U.S. economy did something it hasn't done since COVID. It shrank. What do you make of the data we got today?
Actually, a whole lot less here than meets the eye. So very flashy headline, the US economy shrank, and that feels like the first step in a recession two-step. But there's been something very unusual happening. You might have noticed that we have a new leader here in the United States, and he's very pro-tariff. And the thing is, if people know there's tariffs coming, what they're going to do is they're going to go out and buy stuff in March before the tariffs arrive.
Right.
Now, what that means, in turn, is that the amount of money we're spending no longer bears a clear relationship with what we're producing, because a lot of the money we're spending is on stuff other people are producing. That throws a wrinkle into our whole systems of economic measurement. You don't really want to know how the GDP sausage is made, but let me just say it's bits and pieces and scraps, all of which are imperfect, and they're imperfect in ways that usually work pretty well, but work particularly badly at a moment like this. So looking backwards, I don't actually think this number tells us very much. Having said that, it's only dated for January, February, March. Liberation Day, the big tariff upheaval started on April 2. So if there's a moment when the US economy cracked, it was early April, and we still haven't seen any of the hard data for April.
Okay, but you know, Donald Trump was talking about tariffs in November when he got elected, and you know, the fiscal quarter for the end of 2024 ended pretty good. There was strong growth. Markets responded well for the fourth quarter, and then we go into this. So what do we make of that kind of a shift? I know you said people are kind of changing some of their behavior in anticipation of the tariffs to avoid those higher costs, but is there a weakening of any sort in the overall U.S. economy, you know, from his election up to Liberation Day? Because there sure was market turmoil.
So here's where we want to talk about different types of economic indicators. So hard data is what are people making, how many people have jobs, what are people buying. We only have hard data through to March. These are very reliable data, and they seem to suggest that the US economy kept going pretty well through to March. The exception is that GDP data that came out today, but which I'm warning you is particularly confounded by all of this tariff stuff. Second set of data we have is what's going on in financial markets. Financial markets are people betting, buying and selling based on the future profitability of American business. Financial markets have been very, very unhappy. So that's them effectively betting on the future, saying that American business is going to be less profitable. The only really real data we have for post-Liberation Day is surveys asking people about their expectations of the future, how they feel, what they expect the economy to do, and so on. Those soft data, they're all in the tank. So Trump has absolutely succeeded at making the American people miserable, and we're pretty much here in full-time recession watch. US households are worried, they're aware of what the economic threat is over their heads, and they're making plans, but we haven't yet seen it in the hard data.
Okay, that's interesting. So he hasn't completely tanked the GDP just yet, just the expectations and mood of Americans about where that GDP is going. But we are seeing some other data, Professor, that shipping containers, for example, coming back from China and other places, come back empty because the tariffs are in place, and a lot of these things are inputs that people use for the things that are made in the U.S. and then sold in the U.S., and that is a big five-alarm fire for a lot of people. Explain the significance of that.
Right, so David, this now is the effect of the tariffs, and this now is the hard data, and this is how things roll out. So at some point, they're not even going to send the empty ships. They're just going to stop sending the ships. So one part of this is totally unsurprising. If you put 145% tariff on someone, it's going to be very hard for people to want to buy that stuff with a 145% markup. What is it we buy from China? So you're probably well aware we buy toys and toasters and plastics and iPhones. But actually, one of the other major inputs we buy is equipment and machinery. And so, you know, one way of saying this is every factory around the world can order the machinery that it needs without a 145% upcharge, except American factories.
Right.
So if I owned an American factory, I'd be extremely angry about having been made so uncompetitive. Now, the thing to be clear about here is I shouldn't be angry at Beijing. It's not Beijing that made that equipment more expensive. It's Washington. And so that's part of, so as you put yourself in the shoes of that factory, and that's part of the economic shock that is to come, which is if you stop the ships coming, a whole lot of people are going to have to figure out very quickly how to do things very differently. We tried to do that during COVID. It's very hard. We know that with a Windows computer, if you turn it off and you turn it back on again, it probably works better. But we're pretty sure that's not how economies work.
Well, yes, I mean, he's hitting the U.S. companies from a productivity perspective, from a competitiveness perspective. You know, hiring is slowing down by a lot of the hard data we're seeing. And even if he were to achieve his dream of repatriating all of this manufacturing, it's not clear they even have the labor pool or the workers with the desire to work in a blast furnace or an assembly factory, certainly not a garment factory. But, you know, we don't know exactly what the hard data will be, but it seems pretty clear, Justin Wolfers, that if contraction in the first quarter wasn't quite there, second quarter looks pretty likely, and if there's no change, third quarter almost certain, and the costs and the slowdown over the next 6 months seem like they're pretty inevitable.
I think there's probably if Trump continues on this course, I think there's probably a 75% chance we end up in recession. Wow. You've just painted, David, I think very accurately, the story for why we should be worried and on recession watch. Let me talk about the other 25% because I want to be balanced. The truth is that the single best indicator for how an economy is going to do in the future is how it's been doing in the recent past. And apart from this morning's number, the US economy came into this with a lot of momentum. So think about it as a big cruise liner just moving forward. The question is, did we just hit an iceberg and we're about to sink? Or is the momentum going to carry us through? So you and I are talking about tariffs. We're thinking about tariffs. Anyone who's in an export-oriented field is thinking about tariffs. Anyone who imports inputs is thinking about tariffs. But there are still vast swathes of the economy that are largely unaffected. And the question is, will those swathes of the economy keep the momentum going? It is very hard to stop an economy with momentum. Trump seems to be trying pretty hard, but it's possible we keep moving on.
Well, you know, here in Canada, we feel a little bit like the tugboat or the dinghy that's maybe being pulled by that giant cruise liner. And if it goes down, I mean, we get pulled down with it. Like, we've been pulled up by the U.S. economic strength because of our integration. But the downside risk for this country, for a foreign policy and a trade policy, it does not support and does not control. It's pretty enormous. So if the 75% probability that you give it comes true, I mean, where do you see Canada going? Where do you see the global economy going? Because in no scenario does a trade war between the U.S. and China make everyone richer?
Right. So we've talked about the odds of a U.S. recession, and now you say, let's expand it to the world. So very high chance of a U.S. recession, every reason to be worried. Let's talk about the rest of the world, and I'm going to put Canada aside for the moment, despite knowing that's where your viewers are. So for other countries, the thing to realize is the U.S. is fighting 192 trade wars at once. Every other country, Australia, England, Germany, France, is only fighting one trade war. The US only accounts for 1/10 of global trade. So that means if an Aussie needs somewhere to sell their beef, there's lots of other places that they could go. And in fact, one of my favorite anecdotes is apparently in China, Texas barbecue is very popular. They used to serve Texas steaks. Those became very expensive, so now they're buying Aussie beef.
Right.
So you can see how at the end of that story, the Chinese are getting their beef, the Aussie farmers are selling their stuff, and it's the American farmers who are getting hurt. So as the rest of the world has plenty of other friends to look to. And so I'm much more optimistic that we might avoid a global recession. Now, Canada's a special case because it's not the US and it is part of the world, but it's that part of the world that's right next to the US. And the links between Canada and the US are so much stronger than, say, those between Australia and the US, that even if I could be optimistic about the world, it's hard for me to tell a story where the US goes down without dragging Canada with it.
Yeah, that's the big concern. And it's not just the economic ties, it's the diplomatic ones, the security and defense arrangements. It's destabilized our election. It's probably going to destabilize the relationship. So one last question for you, Professor. I have not studied the American consumer or economics anywhere near your level of depth on this, but my understanding of the American consumer is that they might be the least suited cohort of people for short-term pain for long-term gain. It's very much, I want it, and I want it now, and I want it cheap. So how long do you think the boiling point is in the U.S. before there's real severe pushback against this, if prices start going up and jobs start going down?
Not only is the US consumer not well suited to short-term pain for long-term gain, they're actually facing short-term pain for long-term pain. I have been struck, and as an Econ 101 instructor, pleased by the extent to which the American public has understood the underlying economics of this. If you look at surveys, they're profoundly anti-tariff. They've given up on the Trump administration's economic management. They're about as angry at the White House as a lot of people in Canada might be right now, and I know that takes a lot. And so there's a level of economic literacy outside the White House that unfortunately there's not inside the White House. Trump's polls are falling, and they're falling right now. Consumer confidence is falling. People understand what's happening to the world around them, and they're really angry about it.
Justin Wolfers, Professor of Public Policy and Economics at the University of Michigan. It was really good to meet you, sir. Thanks for being on our show today.
A pleasure, David.
Well, there's criticism of the Conservative Party's campaign coming from some progressive Conservative premiers.
I think that after 4 consecutive losses to the Liberal Party, I think it's time for them to do some soul searching.
Last time I checked, Pierre Poilievre never came out in our election.
The Power Rankings panel is here to talk about all of that and what else caught their attention today. Welcome back to Power and Politics. It's time now for our daily power rankings, and our insiders are here to talk about some of the political fallout from the election results. I'm joined by Nigan Sinclair, a columnist for the Winnipeg Free Press. The CBC's Jason Markusoff is here, and in studio, in person, Marie Vestel, editorial writer for Le Devoir. Good to see you, gang. Happy whatever day this is after the election. It all feels like one big long blur right now.
Must be?
Yeah, something like that. Something like that. Look, the Conservatives gained seats in Monday's election, but some progressive Conservative premiers are firing shots at the federal campaign over how it was run.
Pierre Poilievre never came out in our election. Matter of fact, him or one of his lieutenants told every one of his members, don't you dare go out and help the PCs.
I think the Conservative Party of Canada was very good at pushing people away, not so good at pulling people in, and I think that they probably saw that in some of the results they had across the country.
Okay, Nigan, the conservative on conservative violence continues, at least in Nova Scotia and in Ontario. But, you know, Pierre Poilievre's team, despite his loss, big breakthrough in vote share and seats in Ontario, setback in Nova Scotia. What do you make of what's happening here with the premiers kind of pointing fingers at Poilievre and his inner circle still?
Well, you know, family fights are the worst kind of fights. They get bloody. You really go for the jugular. You're quite mean. There's been some time in which the Conservative side of the spectrum has been splitting in lots of different ways, and we perhaps don't see that as often because when you have the NDP and the Liberals who are have historically, the past 10 years anyways, occupied much of the left-hand side of the spectrum, you can see a pretty clear defining line. What you're seeing here is a Conservative side of the spectrum in which there is clearly a division, and that division has been widening, particularly during this election, talking about a big blue tent or whether there even is a big blue tent or not. You saw that a little bit with the People's Party, and as Pierre Poilievre appealed to those within the People's Party, thinking that would be enough to push him in a direction in which he could get to a larger segment of the Conservative base. He moved away from the more centrist progressive Conservative, and if I dare say, kind of Joe Clark, now Doug Ford, now Tim Houston side of the party. And Pierre Poilievre's going nowhere. And so I think that these two factions, if we call it that, really have to figure out a way to live together, to work together. Maybe they need a treaty.
Right. Yeah, maybe that's what they need. Jason, I don't know if there's a history of infighting with Conservatives in Alberta or not, but I figure I'll just come to you for the. I mean, what do you make of this? Like, you do have two premiers who have just been reelected with big majorities, talking about sort of having purity tests or loyalty tests applied to them by by members of Pierre Poilievre's advisors.
You know, it's really, we were talking about this the other day, and I think day 13 of this post-election period that we had, that we haven't heard any knives coming out yet from the caucus members. But I think back to after Andrew Scheer's loss in 19 and Aaron O'Toole's in 21, and these things take time. They're a slow burn. It took, a matter of weeks or months for either of them to really suffer the slings and arrows of their defeat. Unlike them, though, or to a greater extent, Pierre Poilievre seems like he gained some strength. I mean, yes, Andrew Scheer went from minority to majority government facing to minority, but there was some positives to show. Then this, and Carney's still an uncertain politician against Pierre Poilievre, who's of course going to have his seat now. So I think we'll wait to see how whether things gather. I'm not sure how many MPs. Re-elected or ones who lost will be siding with Doug Ford. Certainly in Nova Scotia may be different where the party did go down from 3 seats to 1. Yeah, and the Atlantic Canadian Tory tradition is it's a lot different than the Western Canadian tradition. Well, and so is Doug Ford's than Pierre's. Well, that's exactly it, right? And Maria, I wonder about this, right? The criticism that Ford doesn't govern conservative enough, that apparently Tim Houston's campaign wasn't willing to, sort of center Pierre Poilievre in his campaign. I mean, maybe they don't govern purely and loyally enough, but they govern, right? And that's kind of what it's all about in politics.
Well, I think in politics you have to be careful what you sow. And if you go for the politics of scorched earth, I think you could say that in English, there's a chance that it'll come back and haunt you, right? So if you ignore people's calls, if you refuse to help them when they ask you, if you threaten them for not towing the line, then maybe those people are going to be a little upset, and maybe they're going to say it publicly. I do think, though, that to Mr. Poilievre's not defense, but in his point of view, they did have he lost his seat, they didn't win government, but he did have a record result nationally. I mean, they got 42% of the vote. In Ontario, they got 44% of the vote. They got
a bigger vote share than Doug
seats.
Ford got.
Yes, right? and they essentially, the Ontario Blue Wall held back the Liberal majority, right? That's what stopped it. So he does have things to show for the election result. But I do think that that whole attitude of what Mr. Ford and Mr. Houston have denounced probably needs to change in the near future. I did notice that Pierre Poilievre in his concession speech did adopt a different tone.
Yeah.
Whoops, we missed the election. No, did adopt a different tone. He was more conciliatory. He did seem to want to collaborate, at least on the U.S. file. I don't know if that will stay, but I do think that some people in caucus do hope that this is sort of a humility moment for him, that he lost his seat, and they do need to reposition, not necessarily policy, but the way they do things.
Well, I wonder if that tone was a product of him knowing what was probably coming in Carleton, because at that time we didn't know the results.
Probably,
I wonder
but maybe he sticks to it.
Yeah, we'll see. That's going to be a big test, and certainly what Chris D'Entremont said earlier in the show, that he'd like to see some of that.
I'm hearing that a lot, yeah.
So Marie, let's get to your pick for today, and this became a very binary election, and as a result, we're ending up with a very almost binary House, right, where two parties got 85% of the votes in this campaign. 85%
of the votes. So my down is the plurality of voices and third parties in the House. 85% of the vote, but 91% of the seats.
Yeah.
That's huge. We haven't seen such a dual political party parliament since 1958. I believe none of us were born.
No. I'm the oldest person here, and I'm not that old.
The Bloc also was not born.
Yes.
The NDP was still the CCF. It was a completely different electoral spectrum.
It was the progressive conservative.
And because in this election it was really a binary choice to who's the best opponent to put against Donald Trump. But I do think it's a down because it does have an impact on democratic debate. What does this mean for people at home who maybe don't watch CPAC or follow the House like us? It means that the Bloc has very few seats in committees, less questions, less votes. It means that the NDP has no seats in committees.
And not even guaranteed a question every day.
Someone is very nice, but not necessarily questions every day, less votes. And sure, the government is a minority government, and they do have to agree and negotiate with one of these two parties for confidence votes, but they don't for policy necessarily. And that's where, committees is where bills get bettered. It's where they get altered for the better. And if you don't have those voices to influence public policy on things like the environment, criminal justice, social issues, I think that's a very big loss for political debate. And I think a lot of voters maybe didn't really think through that they were voting for a government for 4 years. They had the Donald Trump first hurdle in front of them, but that will have an impact for maybe not 4 years, but 2.
Yeah. Nigam, what are your thoughts on that? I guess it depends on two things initially, and how productive committees can be is how sort of accountable and transparent the Liberals are willing to be as a minority government, and how cooperative and non-obstructionist the Conservatives are willing to be as the dominant opposition party right now.
Or how complicit or agreeable or collaborative the NDP will be to prop up that last little gasp, that little gap between the majority position. The NDP is really key in all of that. In this particular case, I think many of us were chanting the death of the NDP. Of course, there's much reason to do so, losing party status and being out in the wilderness, not being leaderless for the most part.
Yep.
But they do hold this kind of interesting moment. I think it's interesting that the NDP, have this little bump, this opportunity to not in the supply and confidence agreement, but to keep the Liberals kind of going on certain key issues. The Bloc has said they're not going to bring the government down anytime soon, or within a year for sure. And that means that we've got some people working together. And I absolutely agree with Marie. When we see the bipolarity of politics, and we just have to look to our relatives to the south, when we see what it looks like in American politics, when the gap is between two specific parties, the way you address those issues become very bipolar as well. They become quite extreme. And we're not just talking about on the right, we're also talking about on the left. That's not good for anybody. And so the key is really how does the NDP move forward to be able to become a voice, even though they are really the voiceless now. They don't get a question, they don't get those roles on committees. But the NDP does hold this kind of interesting position when it comes to the Liberals and keeping them up and moving.
Yeah, I mean, they're there, the bloc is there. I mean, Liz May is there with one seat, but Jason, that's not enough to make a difference, right? It's really going to be, does the bloc side with you, do the NDP side with you? And, you know, on, who knows, on energy legislation and stuff, they might even get some Conservatives to vote with them. But, you know, we'll see on that. Your thoughts on Marie's point?
You know, I mean, I being in Alberta, I see this as a much more pluralistic Commons makeup. For the last two elections, we've had pure NDP on one side, pure United Conservatives on the other side, and it's very much what Nigan talks about. It's very polarized in question period. There's no kind of having these third-party mediator parties, these smaller parties, does add something to the debate, does add something to perspectives, and you do lose that. This was, of course, a very binary choice election. Pierre Poilievre was explicitly running for Prime Minister. I do wonder, if their campaign offerings suggest that it might not be quite as polarized. I mean, Pierre Poilievre was, campaigning as a clear conservative. Mark Carney was not, campaigning as much to the left as Trudeau was.
Yeah, no, he is definitely moving. He's moving to the right. Doesn't mean he's right wing. Just he's moving to the right of where Justin Trudeau was, which is a move back more to the center. But he still is on the progressive side on a lot of progressive issues. There's no question about that. Okay, Nigan, let's get to your pick because while we talk about the polarization, you want to talk about the representation in the House of Commons.
Lost in some of the kerfuffle or the sound of what it was a clearly very important election for Canadians is that we see a record number of Indigenous MPs. There was maybe larger sets of MPs in previous elections, but this time around, we see, for the most part, people who have legitimate Indigenous identities, a dozen entering into the House of Commons, and that's a record. That's while we saw one of the lowest turnouts in recent memory over the past decades of people who applied or put their name forward for office, only 45 as opposed to 79 just a few years ago. You saw the record number of Indigenous MPs, mostly in northern areas, and I think in many ways, Indigenous peoples did make their impression in certain ridings. Certainly, in many ways, choosing the Liberals, particularly in northern Manitoba, northern Saskatchewan, northern BC, choosing Indigenous MPs to represent them. I think that's a good thing. I think it also brings Indigenous voices at the table. The fact is, Mark Carney doesn't have a lot of experience on this issue. He was criticized fairly heavily of not bringing Indigenous issues to the forefront, even though the Liberal platform was really dynamic, really interesting when it comes to even bringing forth a right for water. And the Conservatives really included the word Indigenous for the very first time in history on their platform, and they have a very strong voice in Ellis Ross in northern BC, very pro-development, certainly fits the Conservative agenda. And so you'll see Indigenous peoples, I think, at the forefront going forward, at least in this government.
And across every party too, Marie, as you went there, from Liberal, NDP, Conservative, and Bloc. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm just going to pivot a bit, but to build on that, which I think it's a great thing. I think we need more diversity voices. Like to my point on third parties, at least we get more diverse MPs. If they're not from different parties, at least we have diverse perspectives, which I think is crucial in politics. I do have one caveat, if I can slightly pivot, is on gender parity. There's only 30% of the new MPs who are women, 102 MPs. Right. And that is because we didn't have a lot of women candidates. Only the NDP had 51%. If you look at the Conservatives, it was 23%, the Liberals 36%, the Bloc 41%. If you don't have candidates, proof in the pudding again, you won't have MPs, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, and a big thing there, as we've talked about a lot on the show, is the toxicity and the security environment for politics is driving a lot of women out. Municipal politics in Quebec has been hammered with this.
And visual minorities as well.
Yeah. It's just the society needs to become a better place, for that to change. Jason, your quick thoughts.
To underline what Nigan was saying, I want to emphasize some of the depth of experience of some of the First Nations or Indigenous candidates that were elected. Ellis Ross, he mentioned, was a cabinet minister under the Liberal government in BC, and Buckley Belanger, a cabinet minister from the Saskatchewan NDP governments elected in northern Saskatchewan.
And a former power panelist, Jason. He was on this
correct.
show.
Yes,
you know, he got that bump.
That's the only
We're huge in Desnethe.
I only know him through an earpiece. That's correct. But he's, given that he's the only Saskatchewan MP elected for the Liberals, he's well on track to become the first Liberal Saskatchewan MP not named Ralph Goodale in my lifetime or so?
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Well, at least since 2015. 2015 was the last time they won a seat there. I don't know what it means for cabinet positions because not every province got a cabinet position last time. And Mark Carney does it a little bit differently, though he is promising gender parity, to go back to Marie's point.
Yep.
Jason, let's get to your pick. We got about 3.5 minutes left. What do you got for us today?
My up is the likelihood that there will be a separation referendum in Alberta. I feel strange saying that, but that's what's on track. Yesterday, the day after the election, Danielle Smith and the United Conservative Government passed or put forward a legislation that does a whole bunch of things, bringing in to our election system, including lowering the threshold required for a citizen's petition for a referendum on constitutional items. Basically, what it means is that now only 177,000 signatures, or about less than 4% of the population, must sign a petition in a 4-month period to force a major referendum, including one on separation. And there are a whole bunch of people organizing and licking their chops at this. So it would not be surprising to me if we are putting on track for not separation, because a vast majority of Albertans do not want that, but a referendum. And I don't know, Marie, will the markets like that? What's the experience from Quebec on that? I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, Marie, you probably have more experience with this. So,
I was born for the second one.
Yeah, Danielle Smith was on the show last night, and she made the point that, the government won't be pushing a referendum, but it is.
I mean,
it seems, people like Preston Mann have been talking about it, and it seems like it's not going to be a non-issue.
And less than 12 hours after the election, she put out a statement saying she would facilitate the discussion. So, I mean, she's not leading it, but she's facilitating it. So I think we're mincing words. I mean, again, it's like we have this ongoing theme in our panel tonight. But again, this speaks to the polarization, I think, of the results. The voting numbers for each party were very, very close. Less than 480,000 votes separate the Liberals and the Conservatives. That's not a lot of people, and that means that the country is quite divided. And I do think it's one of the bigger challenges for the Carney government, not that they are missing challenges, they have quite a list, but this one I think is one, because at a time where you need to be united facing Donald Trump, and at a time where his economic agenda requires provincial cooperation for interprovincial trade, recognizing work credentials, he even wants more spaces for daycare. Like, there's a lot of things in his platform, which Quebec would say is interference, but anyway, there's a lot of things in its platform that need provincial buy-in, thank you. And this is not looking great. And anyway, for the sake of the country, this should ideally not be the conversation we're having.
Yeah, it is. Anyway, it's interesting to see it. But Nigan, geographic challenges are constant in Canada, could be exacerbated right now.
Well, I'm surprised Marie didn't talk about what is the biggest Achilles heel of Quebec separatism. It is the basic fact that if any province decides to cancel their representation, their relationship with the Confederation, and then simply just remove their relationship with the Crown, and then end their time and separate, that means the land goes immediately back to First Nations. And so I wonder, is Alberta ready for what will be a long, drawn-out negotiation? Because unlike the first half of Confederation, we, First Nations, have lawyers now, and these are important moments in which you want to start your negotiation process early, because it will take decades to negotiate with First Nations. And First Nations have an option to stay with Canada. That's what Quebec learned the hard way, and that you can't just simply secede without talking to the constitutional basis of the people in which they were there first.
Okay, the show ends in 30 seconds, so we're going to have to stop it there, because there's a lot more to talk about on that topic, and we do not have time. Jason Markisoff, Nigan Sinclair, and Marie Vastel, really good to see you all. Thank you for being here, and thank you all for being here. I am David Cochran. Thanks for watching Power and Politics today and every other day. Hannah Mansing tonight is next here on CBC News Network. I'll see you in 22 hours with the next edition of this show. Thanks for watching, everybody.